Good morning. Last weekend, a group of us from here went up to Ananda village and we performed a little play that we'd created from a short story that Swami wrote. The story is called The Singer and the Nightingale, and it's the story about a great singer whose note of A goes flat, and then the birds come and rescue him and teach him how to sing again. And it's an allegory about the soul's long journey, and it's both very touching and utterly ridiculous. And we did it very well, both sides of it. And it sort of immersed me for a time in what, for me at least, is a very deep samskar of the performing arts, which is very active in a lot of us here. You just basically give about half of you sitting out there the opportunity to seize the microphone, and we have to pry your little fingers off of it. I being one of those people, you know, feel perfectly comfortable in front of a microphone. I spend half my life in front of one or next to one, whatever the case may be. And in the course of things, I visited an old friend at the village. She has 2 children, and I haven't seen her very often because we live far away. So her little girl, about 5, is a visual artist. She inherited it from her mother, Isabella, for those of you who know her. And she makes about, she tells me proudly, she makes about 1 inch of pictures every day. She literally spends hours every day with her colored markers. And I just sat at the breakfast table, and Isabel starts making a tree with this tremendous intensity, you know, that children can have, but her intensity was obviously a carried over energy from some previous incarnation. Master says one of the ways you can tell your past lives is by the things that you're very, very interested in when you're small. It's not necessarily an indication of where you're going to go this life, but it can be. I have a very vivid memory. I have 2 vivid memories, speaking of art. I've shared with you my memory of myself as a ballet dancer at the age of 6. And the most notable thing about that is as I grew older and even into adulthood, I always had this marvelous picture of myself as a ballet dancer when I was 6 and 7 years old. And, you know, as my sophistication grew, my memory of myself grew, until I actually saw a photograph. And, you know, I'm standing about like this, you know, just lacking all of the grace that my mind had infused my body with. I read an interesting explanation once that a psychic said, true or whether this is true or otherwise it could be true, that often when children are performing at the age of 3, 4, and 5, and they have such an inflated sense of the artistry of what they're doing, that they're actually living out other incarnations. And so even though the little body they have can't respond musically or artistically, in their own minds, they're living back to the time when they had spent a long time developing that art. And so they feel like they're moving like that because their consciousness is more fluid at those ages. Well, in that light, I remember at the age of 4, my next door neighbor and I made sculpture. We made sculpture out of mud, and I can still visualize the statue I made. It was 3 balls, one on top of the other. And it was so artistic to me. And working with the clay, quote, and I remember taking it into my mother, trying to persuade her to put it in the oven, you know, so that she could fire it, so that it would become a piece of pottery. And I can still remember how very confused I was, why she couldn't, first of all, why she didn't see what a beautiful piece of art it was. And secondly, why she couldn't just follow through on what I had in mind. Because to me it was so natural. It was just there to happen. And this kind of bewilderment that children often have, trying to figure out what's really going on in this world. Because many children, you know, are not happy when they're small. You think it's such a carefree age, but often it's a time of intense frustration for all these reasons, because there's this memory of being old. Remember, I've told you before, when Swamiji once he was visiting the school here, and the school children were so intrigued by him, partly because they'd heard so much about him. He was the founder of their school, he was the founder of their school system, but he was also a confusing vibration for the children, because he looked older. He had white hair, he moved like a grandfather, but he didn't have an old spirit. And children picking up vibrations, and Swamiji also has this peculiar characteristic, which he relates only to the soul nature of people, so he related to the children appropriately as children, but he didn't see them as children, and they could sort of feel this. I mean, I can sort of feel this. It's very confusing, you know, compared to what we're used to. And so one of the little girls finally, just after staring at Swami for a really long time, just walked right up to him and said, "How old are you anyway?" Just complete bewilderment. And he, sensing the depth of her question, just looked right in her eyes and he said, "Well, let me put it this way. When you were an old woman, I was a little boy." And she just was sort of, and then something kind of clicked in her mind and she wandered off. He was referring to the fact that this is cyclical. Just because I'm old now and you're young doesn't have anything to do with anything, really, because our souls have always had the same reality. Now, I'm watching little Isabel draw, and drawing is something that many little children do, and few children are able to carry that confident skill into adulthood. I mean, I think perhaps more than almost any of the other skills, it's the one that just gets lost somewhere along the line. And many of us can remember the moment when the teacher told us that cows aren't purple and therefore we've drawn it wrong, or whatever it is that we were doing. But there's something much more profound that happens. We just lose this sort of freedom of self-expression, this freedom of feeling that whatever comes through me, whatever there is to be done, I can do it. I can sing, I can dance, I can make sculpture, I can make pictures. And it's very interesting. Swamiji has written a book, and it's called Art as a Hidden Message. It's a bit of a hidden title. It takes a little while until you get into that book to understand what it's about. That book has had about 8 iterations and about 8 different titles. One of the titles was The Artist as a Channel, meaning the artist as a channel for divine consciousness. Art as a hidden message, the superconscious approach to art. There's all these different ways of saying it. Well, I had to teach that. I didn't have to, but I chose to give a class on that book, which is still available from our website or from our boutique back here. I hope you'll be interested in it after I finish talking about it. And when I read that book, I was extremely intrigued because Swamiji essentially said that to be a creative artist is a necessary element for God realization. And it would be not what you would normally think, because it's not to say that we have to make our living as a dancer or make a career as a singer or any of those things. But what he's talking about is that creativity is the nature of the universe. I mean, we speak, in fact, a synonym for God is the creator, isn't it? The infinite creator. We talk about creation. I mean, all of our words about our own little self-expression are all elevated to capital letters to define what's happening everywhere. And what we look at this world, and it's in a constant state of ever-changing, ever-renewed reality. Isn't that so? I mean, it's coming into fall, the plants are beginning to die, the autumn flowering plants are coming out, the summer plants are dying, and then the roses will hide for a while, and then in the spring they'll burst forth again, and we see new life. I mean, just spending my time with this little child and looking at her little face and just realizing that day by day that face is going to change. It's an ever new creative process that we're living in. In fact, one of the most beautiful words for the infinite is Sat Chit Anandam, which means ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. It's a beautiful synonym for that very inelegant word in English, which is God. Because the word God, what are we really talking about? Who wants to realize God? What does that mean? Does that mean I become one with this old man up on a cloud? What we're really talking about is Sat Chit Anandam. And when Swamiji describes in the way of the Ananda Sangha, the description of what Ananda stands for, we believe that the all-pervading reality of this creation is Sat Chit Anandam, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new joy. On the wall above your heads on the side here, it says, "From joy I came, for joy I live, in sacred joy I melt." That's English for saying Sat Chit Anandam. It's always been there, it will always be there, and that's where I will go in the end. That it is who I am and what I'm looking for. Now, that endlessly ever new process, how is it ever new joy? Because it's constantly recreating itself. So we have this very abstract idea that we're supposed to become channels for the divine, that we're supposed to become in tune with the divine, that we're supposed to become expressions, and we're supposed to surrender to this, and all these different things. And we're supposed to take this little, small sense of identity and transcend it into something else. And all these are just absolutely beautiful concepts, and we can talk about them endlessly and write poetry about them and sing songs about them. But when you get up in the morning, what does that really mean? And when Swami's writing about this in the context of creative art, he's beginning to talk about how we really make these things manifest in our lives, that we become in tune with this process of ever new beauty, ever new creativity, ever new expressions of our simple awareness of being alive. That's what you see this little child doing. Isabel makes me a picture of a tree. You know, she just very intently, she has a picture in her mind of what this tree is supposed to be, and with, you know, great willpower, she makes this very, very dark green tree and hands it to me with great enthusiasm, and you can just feel in it all of her relationship to that reality. And what she's expressing is she's making manifest her sense of a greater reality than just herself. And this is the essence of what creativity is really all about. We're just recognizing that there's this ever-renewing process going on that we can be a part of. Whether we open our mouths and instead of ordinary speech, we suddenly put out these beautiful melodies like our singers have been doing for us for years, and again this morning sang so beautifully. Just suddenly, instead of just being this little limited ego with all its body imperatives and all its concerns about this, that, and the other thing, it finds this vibration of music that's just happening there and then suddenly becomes a channel for it. Swamiji has written a piano sonata, has 3 movements to it. It's called The Divine Romance. The first movement is a song also that we often sing. This is a beautiful song. The first and third movement both have lyrics for part of it at least. Well, there was this woman at Ananda Village. Her name is something or another, Mukti. And she's a pianist, and she's been learning to play that piece. And she's skillful enough, and she'd brought it to a point of perfection sufficiently where she asked Swami to listen to her play it. And she sat at this grand piano, which is in the Crystal Hermitage, for those of you who know. It was Swami's mother's piano. She gave it to him. And then Swami sat in a chair just right next to her, and she just played it bar by bar. You know, just would play a little phrase of it, and then he would stop and correct her. And he was correcting her in the most minute ways, and she was both totally receptive to him, not at all defensive. And she was also skilled enough that she could hear what he said and then translate it into playing, and she knew how to write it down and so on. And after a while, when he was, you know, just like a quarter of a note, an eighth of a note, just a little bit of a phrase, he said, I don't mean to be picky about this. He said, I'm not trying to be difficult. He said, but I didn't write this, I heard it. And so I'm just, when I hear you play it, I can contrast it to what I heard, and then I can tell you what it actually sounds like. And that this piece doesn't belong to either of us. This piece simply exists. And so now I'm helping you to play it as I heard it. And he was saying to her, I couldn't have written any of these things down. They're just too subtle. But she was able, because she was in tune, to pick that up. Now, that's a very concrete, what I'm trying to say with this is the whole concept of God, the whole concept of Satchidanandam, the whole concept of master, of guru, it's really gigantic. And if we're thinking even of being disciples, we have masters here whose pictures are represented, but you know, how can we be like Yogananda? Sometimes amusingly, especially in the 60s and the 70s when these ashram movements were just beginning, a lot of people who had Indian gurus would adopt Indian accents, really literally. So they'd speak English with a funny Indian accent, because in some way that was like they were trying to be their guru, be like their guru. And it was a little disconcerting. Somehow you felt like it was sincerely intended, but somehow we're missing the point here. Because we're not trying to channel anything as superficial as the culture you came from. We're trying to channel Satchidanandam, ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss. But we have to bring these things down to something very concrete. And just the simple ability, and this again, back to Swamiji's book, the simple ability to be in the flow of the divine ever-newness, and then without all this anxiety about who am I, what am I doing, how am I going to fit into this, to just be in that flow and just put forward just some little expression of ourself, whether it's perfect art or not. Just that effort to do that is beginning to put us into the reality where our consciousness is trying to go. And when a group of singers stands here, I keep going to want to stand where Mary Ellen was standing because her voice is so strong and so beautiful. I guess I'm trying to be her. Like this, like that. But in order to sing as beautifully as she and many of these singers sing, you can't simultaneously be asking questions about yourself. Oh, gee, I wonder if everybody really likes this singing. Is this my best side? Is this dress really the one I should wear? I live without fear. You know, it's just not going to work. There has to be this absolute surrender to some other flow than oneself. Isn't that so? And what definition is there of divine realization except utter, well, self-forgetfulness? Now, yes, it's true that artistic beauty is a very powerful element for learning this, because in the end, that which the divine, the expression that comes through us is beautiful. Yes, it's true that the divine also manifests in many other ways. You know, there's a great deal of ugliness in this world, and you have to, in the end, say that it's all divine. But what we're looking for is that ever-new joy, which is uplifting and as beauty in this sense. But there's another element of this also, and this was in the one of the classes I was giving on the Bhagavad Gita. We've been doing this class series on Swami's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita for, well, I'm on class 38, so that's how long we've been doing it on a weekly basis, intermittently. It's like a 2-year cycle that we're working with. But there's this section of the Bhagavad Gita where it just verse after verse after verse after verse that God says in the form of Krishna, among gamblers, I am this one. Among great artists, I am this one. Among rivers, I am this one. Among birds, I am that one. And what he's really saying, what the Krishna is saying, is that the apex, the most exquisite expression of every aspect of life is the divine. And he even throws in a few dark ones. Among gamblers, in some translations, it says, I am Sakuni. And Sakuni is this very, effective but extremely unhonorable gambler. But even the perfection of evil also is drawing to a focus these same forces, not in a way that's very helpful, but still there's a focused power in that. Now, the commentary that Swami made on that was so interesting to me, because what he's saying is it isn't as if God is more present in one form or another, because philosophically, you see, that's impossible. Everything is created of the same divine substance. Everything in essence is Satchidanandam. There was nothing else from which this entire reality could be created except the consciousness of the divine. Master was very emphatic on that point. He said to one of his disciples, you must understand, God loves you just as much as he loves me or Krishna or Buddha or any of the great masters, because that love is freely given and is our own nature. There's not more God in one place. It's just that God is more easily observed when the cloud of conflicting consciousness is moved away. And in the Gita, they talk about it as tamasic energy, which is dark, dull energy, or rajasic energy, restless rajas, which is just activating but not focused, kind of like America, really active but not real focused all the time. And then the pure energy is the sattvic energy, which is the pure presence of the divine. Now, what I understood in that commentary was something that I'd never quite been able to grasp in my life. Why? You have to try very hard to be excellent. Whereas, in fact, you would think, well, if it's all a dream and it doesn't matter anyway, why should I put out so much effort? Isn't that sort of a natural thought? You think, well, it's all going to end in death anyway. It just comes and goes. You can never really push your wave up to the top and hold it there. If it's just alternating light and darkness, whoopee, let me just sort of run through this and just have a free ride. But when you see people who've taken that approach, it's never inspiring. And that's a clue. There's a clue there that somehow these people don't uplift your consciousness. And also, in the experience that I've certainly personally had with Swami Kriyananda representing to us the way Master taught them, he's been very insistent on excellence at all times. Certainly in such a way, only asking of people what they are able to give, bear in mind. You know, not an unreasonable excellence that makes a person feel less competent at the end, but just always asking in an appropriate way for what is possible next. I mean, if someone offers to him something that, objectively speaking, might be mediocre art, but he knows that they've put their best effort into it, he always praises it, he always likes it. What he really approves of is the right energy. I myself went through really a long, extremely difficult process for me because he wanted me to learn to write. And I've always, you know, the microphone comes easy. The pen has always been more of a struggle for who knows what reasons. But literally, for almost a whole decade, I was working on promotions and publicity for Ananda, and we had this little relationship, which is I would get the assignment, I would knock myself out to try to write it. He would get it in his hands, he would drop it in the wastebasket, and then he would rewrite whatever needed to be done. But he would never write it until I wrote it, until he could throw it away. And sometimes he would throw it away, I'm not kidding you, without reading it. He would hold it in his hand, and he would be able to tell that the magnetism was inadequate. Amazing, isn't that? Now, sometimes I took it really well. Sometimes I didn't take it very well at all. It was not at all easy. But he knew that there were obscuring elements of pure laziness and unfocused, restless energy that was keeping me from being able to do what he knew was in me to do. I loved once he said, "You really don't know what you want to say, so just to be sure you say it 2 or 3 times." Which at the time, I was too foggy-minded to know what he meant. But later on, when I looked at my own writing, I could see that was exactly what happened. Oh, let me just sort of just gather up every possible idea from, you know, every garbage can I can think of, and I'll dump it into this paragraph, and maybe one of them will hit lucky. You know, just lacking the trained concentration to focus. And I actually finally just couldn't handle it. I just refused to do any more writing for quite a few years. It wasn't until I moved here and I had to write all the advertising. Advertising is really what teaches you to write because you have 50 words. That's pretty much it. And after that, I began to learn how to focus. But that whole process was the process for me of having a standard, in this case forced upon me, that just caused me to have to continuously break through that tamasic energy and that rajasic energy that was keeping me so self-involved that I could never hear what actually needed to be said. I could never tune in to that impersonal divine force. Now, all of us have that same project in front of us. And it's not, you know, some spiritual paths have tried to have you get over the ego by just simply suppressing it. That's been the old Kali Yuga Catholic, with all due respect, method, you know. It's just you're obedient to your superior, no matter what kind of an idiot your superior happens to be. You just are, and everything about you just becomes more and more suppressed. Well, that's not what's happening now. That's certainly not our path. It's very interesting to notice that our own master, Paramhansa Yogananda, he was a singer, he was a poet, he wrote songs, he played instruments, and he wrote beautiful literature, you know, beautiful writing. He was a creative artist himself. Here he is for Dwapara Yuga. I mean, there have been others, especially in India, many artistically creative, but the whole Catholic tradition, Christian tradition, we're steeped in is you get out of your ego by just crushing it. But what Master has presented for us is the way you get out of your ego is that you tune into something so much greater, that you use it to become an instrument of this exquisite beauty. And then Swami Kriyananda, it's just overwhelming, his creativity. In every field he puts his mind to, you know, from architecture to photography to music, everything. He just decides. And he always is telling us, oh, this is nothing special. You just decide clearly what you want, then you put your mind at the spiritual eye, and then you demand that God give it to you. Okay, that sounds like a really good idea, but he really means it. And he really does mean it. Little Isabella, she wasn't thinking about anything. She just had this picture of a tree, and she was darn well going to draw it for me. And she drew it like this with just all of her energy. Be ye therefore like little children. This last weekend when we were doing this play, and there's so many ridiculous roles in it, and all of our devotees, our beautifully dignified, deeply spiritual devotees, just wholeheartedly gave themselves over to being so foolish And it was so marvelous. There was something so profoundly uplifting about it. Just to see that complete freedom. I was thinking of Matthew standing up here reading, who's a very, very gifted actor, and just his ability to just stand up and just forget everything about who he was and just be whatever is meant to be now. You see how deeply spiritual that is? Especially if what you're trying to be is uplifting. And that's what Swamiji writes about, is the great tragedy of art today is that it's intended to pull people down about as far as human consciousness can go. It's really a conscientious plot to use art to just destroy our spirituality. And the resurrection of art as a spiritual exercise is one of Paramahansa Yogananda's messages to the world, carried out through Swamiji. And you see how much fun the spiritual path becomes? Just all of a sudden. And don't think you have to actually be able to draw or paint or dance or anything like that. Just whatever we do it with absolute creativity. Swamiji also taught me to cook. I didn't have any neurosis about cooking, so he taught me to cook in 3 days. Just by cooking with me and liberating me from my crazy ideas. I was cooking for the whole community at that time. It was really an act of self-defense on his part because I was in charge of the major kitchen, and every event that happened, I made all the meals, and they were awful. I mean, really awful. I just couldn't, I wanted to cook well. First, I didn't want to cook well. First, I just wanted things to be healthy. I was sublimely indifferent. Then there was a palace revolt, and they got kind of like, I thought they were going to, you know, just choke me on a carrot, bludgeon me to unconscious with an organic carrot if I didn't feed them something else. So, but by then I wanted to, but I just didn't know how. And Swamiji, it was very interesting how he did it with me. I worked really hard all day on this big meal, and it was just awful. And afterwards, Swami said, you know, the main dish was a little bland, he said so delicately, a little bland. Oh, yes, sir, I know. I don't know why it came out that way. Seeing me receptive, he said, in fact, much of what you cook is, well, a little bland. I said, oh, sir, I'm trying so hard, I just don't know. I mean, I couldn't even follow a recipe. I don't know what was wrong with me. And so then he said, would you like me to teach you to cook? I said, sure, you know, and then everybody around him is going, yes, yes, you know. And so this Swami was visiting us at the time, who shall remain nameless. Let's just say he liked to eat, and it showed on his body. He was a great, big fellow. And he was visiting Swamiji for 3 days. This was like 1972. And he came to Swamiji's house 3 times a day for meals for 3 days. And Swamiji had me cook with him. Now, I'm so mental, I was especially then. I arrived with a notebook and a pen, you know. I'm just ready. He's going to teach me how to cook. So we start cooking, and he says, well, you put a little of this in, and I'm frantically writing a little of that. Oops, that's too much. Well, we'll just put some more of this to balance it, and then we'll put this and this. And I'm, you know, desperately trying to write what? A little of this, a little of that. I didn't even know what we were putting in. And finally, very quickly, I realized this is not going to work, and I just put down my pen and paper, and I just sort of worked with him. And by the time we got to the 9th meal, for some reason, we were all sort of stretched out on the floor. We were sitting on the floor or reclining on the floor. There's about 8 or 9 people. And we decided we'd have fruit salad. Seva said, oh, I'll just go up and I'll fix it. And Swami said, sure, that would be nice. And they said, no, I'm teaching Asha to cook. He said like that. And so, come Asha, let's make it. And so we went up and we cut fruit. I mean, I don't know what he was doing. The next morning, I knew how to cook. I did. I really knew how to cook, and I'm considered to be a very good cook. I say this because, well, just because it was so astonishing to me. I just suddenly could tell how to make things good. I tried to put this story in the book that I wrote about Swami, but I couldn't figure out how to universalize it. Maybe this is more of it. But somehow or another, what he taught me was that it's just there. And if we tune in on that level, we'll just discover that it's there. And it just starts coming out of us. And after that, you know, most of the time, I can just make food taste good. I don't even know how. I don't even care that much. Some of my friends are really, really good cooks. I just know because he opened up in me this ability to tune in to a creative reality. Now, as I say, this is a very personal story, which is why I'm telling it in a sermon, but I never even got it into my book. But that's what it's about. And if you're taking care of children, if you're waiting on customers in a store, if you're doing gardening or something that's more obvious like that, if you're doing physical labor, if you're Xeroxing. I know David Gamow told me this story of having a job. Once he got a job for about 6 or 8 months and he had to Xerox. Just one of those karmic things that happens. And he just talked about, okay, I'm going to Xerox. And so he started having contests with himself about how fast he could Xerox. And he started singing songs and making up lyrics to the rhythm of the Xerox machine, you know. Just whatever you're doing, just figure there's a bigger reality that can be part of this. And that bigger reality, you see, is ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. And then we strive for excellence, because in striving for excellence, what we're overcoming is ourselves. And we have to make our spiritual practice concrete. We can't just sort of vaguely in the clouds think, oh yeah, this and I love God, but every day just live in a perfectly ordinary way. We have to make it concrete. And creative art, for this particular yuga, this particular time, creativity in everything that we do, that's what God is asking of us. And aren't we lucky, you know? Isn't this a fortunate thing? I mean, personally, I've had it with the suppression of the ego and all this yes ma'am, yes sir, whatever you say. The SRF monasteries are much more obedience-oriented. And Swami said to me about 1971, you would never have made it in those monasteries. I said, I consider that a compliment. Did you intend it as such? You know, a lot of us just have this very independent nature, but let's use this independent nature to get us toward freedom. Because merely to be independent, you know, garners us absolutely nothing. We get to then have our own will in everything. What a hell, you know? What we really want to be is independent of our own ego by attuning at all times to that infinite bliss, just like little Isabella. Oh, isn't this fun? Don't we just love doing this? Don't we just love being part of something bigger? And then look at this wonderful thing that God did with me. What joy, what joy, what joy. God bless you.